Hi, hello, and welcome to a brand new series called Night Laravel. In this series, we'll be creating simple, fun, API-based applications that you can use in your everyday projects. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. In this series, we'll be using the latest version of Laravel, which as of now is 7.x. And of course, this version will keep changing as we progress in this series. So, the first step is to install the Laravel framework. To do that, we'll use Composer. And if we scroll down the documentation to the Wire Composer section, we see the Composer command here. Let's copy that and open up a completely empty folder here. Open my terminal. And let's paste that in. I'll give it a name LNL. Great. And as you can see, the project is installed. We have all our files. So let's go to our browser. And oops, there's an exception, there's a permission error, so let's fix that. Now of course I'm going to be giving just a 777 because it's my local host, but on a production server you won't be giving the correct permissions just to your Apache user. Type in my password and that should fix it. Now that we have the framework installed, let's open it up in an IDE. I'm using PHP Storm, but you can use whatever you want, that's completely up to you. So in our project folder, let's go into the routes, API, and as you can see, Laravel gives us a default route. Let's get rid of that, we don't need it. And let's type out our own. Just a simple backslash function, and we'll say hello from the API, save it, go to our browser, /API, hello from the API. So one last thing we need to do is set up our database. For that, let's log into MySQL. I'm using the terminal. So let's create a database called LNL1. And let's create a user to access that database with the same name, just to keep it simple. And of course, we'll need a password. So I like to use an online tool called Strong Password Generator. You can use anything, you can search it on Google, it's freely available. So let's put in that password. And lastly, we need to grant permissions for that user so it can access that database. Now of course you can set certain privileges that you want, but in general it's alright to give all privileges to a specific database. Now let's put in these credentials into the .env file located in our Laravel application. So we'll enter the database, which is LLN1, and the username is the same. And the password you can just paste in. Laravel has these default migrations for creating the users table and the jobs table and the migrations table. Let's run the migration command and see if it works. Looks like it all went well. Let's connect to our database and see if these actually work. I'm using the PHP Storm MySQL client itself. just to make things easier. Let's test that. Okay, looks like it's connected correctly. And within the schemas we can see our database, and yes, we see all three tables have been created correctly. Okay, so finally, after all that setup, we can get down to coding our authentication. We'll be using Laravel's official package called Passport, and let me get that set up real quick. Basically, there are just four things that we need to do. One is we run the composer command to require Laravel Passport. Second thing we need to do is migrate all the Passport database tables with the migration command. We need to run the Passport install command. And lastly, we need to set up the has API tokens trait. Now let's add the Passport routes in our auth service provider. And lastly, tell Laravel to use Passport as our API authentication driver. Before we start testing all this out, let's seed some data into our database. I'll create a new database seeder called user seeder. And very quickly, we'll just use the default user factory. Create 10 random users, and let's just seed them into our database. And as you can see, in our users table, we have now 10 random users. Okay, next we need to make a controller. Now I'm going to put our controller into an API folder, and I'm also going to make a subfolder called v1 because we want to have versions for our API. And to further categorize it, we'll put it into a users folder because this controller is for user authentication. First thing we need is a login function. Now typically a login function takes two parameters, so username and password, but we need to validate that first. So we should validate, we should attempt to log in with those credentials. If we log in, let's create a user token, and lastly we need to just return all that data. So let me quickly do all that boring stuff and get back to you after it's done. Now of course you can do all this without using Passport. You can use Laravel's inbuilt authentication system, but I just feel Passport is a better way because it uses OAuth, and it's a little more secure, a little more production oriented, and it's good practice to kind of use all that. And as you can see, the user token is generated by Passport with that create token. Okay, next thing we need to do is add our API route. So we'll put v1 users and I'm going to call it login, and we put the action as the controller that we just created with the login function. I think we're ready to do a quick test. Let's start by checking if our route is enabled properly by the route list command. And if we scroll up, yep, there's our login API. Now let's pull up Postman. I've already set up the route endpoint, as you can see, with two parameters, email and password. And we're going to use our seeded table. Take one of our existing email addresses, copy that. And of course the password is always password because we've used our database seeder. And yes, it works. We've got our access token. Let's try it with another one. And sure enough, there it is. Now let's test it with some invalid credentials. We should get an invalid credential message. Yep, but we want a different status code to show that's an error. Let's go back to our controller, and we haven't set any status codes here. So let's put a 200 for when all is okay, and let's put a 401 for when there's invalid credentials. Let's test that again now. And yes, now we're getting a 401. Let's put the correct credentials again and see, we should get a 200. Yes, we got a 200. Now of course we want more than just a login API. So let's define some more user routes. We already have the login API. We need a logout API. So let's define that and let it call the logout function. And lastly, we need a user register function. So let's call that register, and we'll make a register function for that. Now I'm going to do that in the form of a quick time lapse. And while that is going on, I just want to remind you guys, if you're doing this for a production project, please make sure that you put in correct validations, correct permissions, because what I'm doing right here is for fun and it's on my local system. For production ready code, you need to add more validation, you need to add more security, and make sure your routes and especially publicly available APIs should be very secure. I added a couple more things as well. I made route groups so all our V1 APIs are together, a user group for all the user APIs, and I also added the auth API middleware to the logout API. If we take a look at our authentication controller, we have three functions now. The login, which was there earlier, the logout function, which checks if the user is logged in and revokes the token if it is. And finally, we have the register function, which takes 4 parameters, a name, an email, password, and confirm password, and just creates a new user based on that. To finish off, let's test it out in Postman. I've already added our 3 routes, the login, the logout, and the register. The login is the same. The register has 4 fields, as I mentioned, name, email, password, and password confirmation. And the logout passes the authorization token, which we'll get from our login API. So let's quickly test that out. We'll register a new user. Let's call it Jane Doe. And I'll keep the same password 123456. And yes, we have a new user registered. If we hit the send button again, you'll see there's an error message that the email address is already taken. So let's go back to our login API and put in the new registered user's details. And sure enough, we get an access token. Now we can use that access token in the logout API. And when we hit send, we see the logout message. And of course, if we hit send again, now that token is invalid, so we get an unauthenticated message. So let's try it with a new access token. And that's it. That's how we build a simple API-based user authentication system. Thanks for watching. Hit that like button if you liked, or leave a comment if you have something to add, and I'll see you in the next one.